Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And my guest on the podcast today is Baber Farooq. Baber is the Senior Vice President of Product Strategy of Procurement Solutions at SAP. And we recorded today's episode on the conference floor of SAP's recent SAP Sapphire event in Orlando, Florida. Now, SAP has recently commissioned a number of research studies with the Economist, IDC, and Harvard Business Review. And so I caught up with Baber to get a sneak peek into their findings and what these findings mean both for procurement but also for procurement software development. I really enjoyed our conversation. I think you will too. And as always, I started by asking Baber if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
I think, procurement definitely found me, right? I was an engineer by trade, that's what I studied. Civil engineering specifically, along with computer science. And I did an internship in my third year of university, in civil engineering, and I didn't like it. I thought it was just redundant and boring.
Right. So, it's a good time to find that out.
Yeah,
when you're doing your internship
before you actually made it what you did for the rest of your life. And my final year of university, Ariba at the time was recruiting on campus. I had no idea what it really was. I knew it was software and it was interesting, and they were looking for engineers to be part of their deployment consulting group. They were starting a college program, and I think I was fortunate. I was inspired by some of the examples they used. I totally had no idea what I was getting into, right? And my first sort of question when I was thinking about it all was, people need consultants for help with this stuff, right? I mean, because it was like, can't they read the manual or something? It can't be that hard.
Where's the instructions?
Where's the instruction manual to figure out what this thing called an RFX is? But obviously as I got more and more into it, started appreciating the nuances and all of the technicalities around with successfully running a procurement operation, and it's been a lot of fun. Since that time, absolutely.
It's certainly a profession that sucks us in, and then when we get in it, a lot of us stay there. I probably 99% of the people that I ask that question to, because I always start by asking that question, had exactly the same experience, which, it would be nice if we could bring folks into the profession that had the desire to be in the profession to start with, but once you do get in there, a lot of folks do stick.
Well, I think it's funny, right? You raises that point. I think some of it is just a little bit of lack of academic focus on the topic, right? I mean, it's funny, I think 3 years ago or so, the Nobel Prize in economics was awarded to auction theory, right? Which is highly relatable from a procurement perspective. But while you'll have masters in supply chains that are offered, and there's an entire discipline of MBAs from a financial perspective that get, they train you on M&As, and they'll have a sub-discipline on one element of finance versus another. There's not many places where I think you'll find deep dives available in procurement, and I think that's sort of where an initial elevation can come and have people excited about being part of procurement teams even before they enter an organization. Given the importance it has in the world and the importance it has on an organization's bottom line. There's hardly anything more important.
Now, you're talking to a lot of clients, prospects, folks within the procurement industry generally. Are you seeing that there is becoming a greater focus coming through the pandemic? Because we can talk about it from a theory perspective, that yes, we know that procurement supply chain has got a more impactful role to play, or the impact that procurement can play is certainly something that companies are struggling with right now. Are you seeing that in the executives that you talk to, that there is more interest in what procurement can do?
100%. There's no doubt. I think what I would say is that in some of the, we recently did a survey with the Economist group, and some of this data tells that story, is that let's leave out the CPOs, because they already know, I think, that there's more they can contribute than like cost savings, right? But when you talk about COOs and CFOs, every single one of them, I think, that we talk to has an understanding that there's greater potential here, whether we look at it from a sustainability angle, whether we look at it from an angle of how do I streamline my operations, how do I establish alliances and partnerships, because procurement is, one of my customers said, the window to the outside world, right? They don't necessarily know how, right? They don't know how to really, this arm in their business that they've always used to drive more and more compliance and savings, how do you flip that around necessarily and drive this alternative agenda? I think that discipline and muscle isn't necessarily there in most organizations. So to some extent we see that as our obligation, and I think all the different consulting partners that are out there also have that as an obligation to make businesses realize how they can more effectively use procurement to drive their overall organizational agenda. And of course, we want our chief procurement officers to really push the envelope in that respect as well.
It's interesting that you're kind of seeing some of the pull now from the C-suite, because I think one of our greatest challenges has been that as we evolved and matured the profession, we did it based on a business case of cost savings, and therefore we've kind of sent that message to the executives that that's how they should view the value that we can create. And so the next challenge is, okay, how do we go and flip that to demonstrate that no, that's not actually, and that's on us, that's on us to do with our executives, but to see that now some of the executives that would be the ones funding that and funding investment in procurement are starting to think about that themselves, I think is a big it's kind of a turning point, I think, for what procurement can do, because it has to come from the top, essentially, that desire to leverage procurement in a different way.
I think, 100%. I mean, it was the most obvious way you were ever going to get attention in a procurement discipline was you talked about cost savings, right? Or compliance, right? Maybe that's the other angle that you could kind of go through at times. But, let's use sustainability, for example, right? Everyone talks about it. I'm not sure if there are many organizations that are actually defining how they're going to meet that criteria, right? I think it's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for procurement organizations to say, hey, no, this means this much reduction in waste, this much reduction in the usage of all the core components of products that we have to use. It means this much, diversification of suppliers that we're going to enable for you, right? And ultimately, if you look at some of the other results that we're seeing in the market right now, there's an IDC survey that we've looked at, which shows that organizations that are, highly digitized and making sustainability a focus are companies that are performing more both from a profitability and a revenue perspective, right? So, it's about realizing and defining how you may not always get the very clear, give me cost savings and you will get a business case funded, but we know right now that sustainability, for example, is a hot topic. It's just not necessarily defined very specifically. So the sort of challenge to procurement organizations and to CPOs would be, let's help them define it. Let's put up a business case with those metrics and then see where it goes.
And as the data begins to exist to show the impact at a valuation perspective and a profitability perspective of doing that, then it means it's not we should do this because it's the right thing. It's we have to do this because it's a business imperative, and ultimately it shows up in stakeholder or shareholder value that we create.
Absolutely. And I think to some extent that connection has, to the large part, been we want a good story on it. We know that there's something here, but we can't quantify it. But more and more, especially when we talk about, the retention of workforce, right? People want to work for companies that are trying to have a positive impact in the world. Consumers want to buy from organizations that are having a positive impact in the world. Those factors really start playing into, and now there's data. I mean, I think we may not have had that much data even 2 years ago, but I think now we're starting to see more and more data that highlights that story. So, it's funny when you look at a lot of the surveys that are out there, everyone's kind of talking about sustainability, but it's still not getting the complete focus, right? When you list what are the top 4 things you care about, right? It's not meeting the top 4. I don't think that's because it's not actually in the top 4. I think it's because people don't have a path of getting there necessarily. So, actually specifically defining how we will measure it, what we will do to achieve it, is a bold step, but I think a step that procurement organizations should take, and I think they'll see reward as part of that.
Yeah, there was, we're recording this live on the conference floor here at SAP Sapphire in Orlando, and there was a keynote yesterday that actually talks a little bit about, like, as we think about sustainability, because as we discuss the topic of sustainability, it's more about embedding sustainability practices into the business as opposed to thinking of sustainability of being something on the
CSR
outside.
initiative, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, okay, we've got the business and we've got CSR over here,
Yeah.
but it's actually how do we integrate that into every single process, into day-to-day decision making, so that it's not something that's separate. It's something that's just part of everyday business.
And what better organization to do that than procurement?
Right.
I mean, if you talk about the number of suppliers we interact with, if you include contingent workforce, then you talk about the number of people you end up interacting with. I mean, I think there's such a powerful story that we can tell just from, I mean, another survey point, by 2023 we expect, 40 to 50% of organizations to have responsible sourcing practices embedded into their procurement processes, right? So if you are not an organization that has done that, let's start doing it, right? And I think, you want to be leading on that edge rather than lagging on it,
right,
to the extent possible.
You've referenced both the IDC and the Economist reports, and I would love to talk a little bit more and kind of dig into some of the data.
Sure.
Before I do that, just for some context, like what were you looking for when you commissioned? Because you've commissioned two pretty big pieces of research.
Three, actually.
Three, actually. So you've commissioned those pieces of research. What's the thinking behind that, and what are you trying to kind of understand and do with the data?
There's two aspects of it. I think first of all, from our perspective, we want to stop pretending like we know what the market is saying by our anecdotal experiences. I think as a product development group, it's a little bit of a sin that you can very easily make, right? You have 5 customers screaming at you over an issue, and you're like, oh my God, we need to do this. That's not necessarily what the market needs. That's what those 5 customers need.
Right.
That's not necessarily the market. And we had not done this in a long time, right? So from that perspective, we were like, let's go and pulse the market. Let's understand what the market is saying, and then let's try to build solutions to achieve that outcome. And the second thing is that it wasn't supposed to be about SAP. So I think when you read these reports, yes, we've sponsored it, so our mention is there, but there's no mention of SAP products. There's no mention of the way SAP wants to look at the market. Arguably, anyone could take this information and build great products from it, and that's the way we wanted it to be. So it was almost sort of our, contribution to the profession at large. Largely is the way we've always. That's been our guiding principle and North Star in this study, in all of these studies, and that if we do that, then it would be the right foundation from where we can also build product from. Is the way we've thought about it.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate that as well, because I've seen a little bit behind the scenes as you've gone through this process of putting these reports together, and at every single turn I've heard that from many people within SAP about this isn't about us, and it's not about SAP, and it's not about putting SAP's name on it. It's about trying to understand where the procurement function is and those key stakeholders that interact with us. So, it's easy to say that, but I know that having seen behind the scenes that's truly been your guiding light.
It's hard. I mean, it's very, the wrong way to do it would be like, oh, well, we're about to, for example, launch a risk product. Let's go ask questions about risk, right? I mean, that's and then feed that back into our storyline. Like that, sure, you could do that, but that's not would not be an honest way to approach the problem and to make an impact on the profession. I mean, I think what we wanted to really understand was, where is the gap? Is there a gap in what people are looking for? And there could be several, right? And then what would we prioritize in terms of trying to contribute in terms of giving a solution to the market? And then, of course, we will validate all of this with our customers, and as we get into the maturity of product design and so on and so forth. But that's what was behind the impetus of the research. And it's something we want to do on a continuous basis. It's not something that we do once and we forget about it, right? I mean, I think it's so funny. When we commissioned the CPO survey with the Economist group, there wasn't a war in Europe.
Things change quickly.
It almost seems like it's, unfortunately, a lot of it might already be irrelevant to some extent, right? Because the priorities could have changed. It's not even published yet. We just gathered the data. But when the cycle for the survey was happening, there was not a war going on in Europe. So it reemphasizes how quickly things are changing and how you have to be on top of it constantly if you want to properly pulse the market and appreciate the profession.
So I want to take a couple of different paths with the data and the insights that you've collected. One is to talk about outcomes, so the outcomes that procurement is driving and how that's changing or where their priorities are. But then internally as well, what does that mean for how procurement is thinking about their own operating model and the use of technology and what it means for us as professionals. When I think of it from an outcome perspective, what are some of the things that you're finding that procurement really is focusing on, right now here in, early to mid 2022?
So, a couple things, right? First of all, there's an element of the main thing is the main thing, right? It's not as if cost and risk don't matter.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be very clear. Procurement still has an absolute obligation to deliver to cost objectives and minimize risk as a result of their profession. And I say that because, a lot of the times when we start talking about the extremes of the hype cycle, we can kind of lose focus on the main thing, right? So that is not going anywhere. That is still an expectation of procurement leaders and an expectation of the lines of businesses they report into. Yeah. That's still going to be an important
kind of
factor.
The principal reasons for being.
Absolutely. I don't think you can shy away from that, as much as we want to make sure that we elevate the profession in general, right? So that's still important. And honestly, given that we might be entering a recession, right, or at least some difficult times with rising interest rates, I think you can expect that to become more and more of a focus, right, as time continues. So when you talk about how we're going to achieve those objectives, two things that stood out, and arguably you didn't need to do a survey to understand this, but it's good to have validation with numbers. User experience and mobile, right? There's the number one thing that people are sort of pointing to continuously is that we need to have strong user experiences, we need to have strong mobile experiences. We've anecdotally also heard this from our customers. So it's really interesting and powerful to sort of get this sort of data, and it helps us also prioritize. If we have $10 to spend, right? Where do you spend? If you spend $7 of those dollars on UX, it's not a bad thing, right? And there is UX improvements. There's new mobile apps that we're launching. We're accelerating that strategy, sort of already as off the back of some of these survey results. The most interesting finding that I think that we have found so far is that category management is a space where people are looking for a digital solution. Yeah. Right. And this was we had an idea. We had heard this from some of our customers, but it has really become an impetus by which we are accelerating development efforts in this area. So what's interesting is that our customers are saying, hey, we do category management. It's not like we don't do it, right? But we do it in like PowerPoint and spreadsheets and flash it at the start of the year and then, hope no one asks about it again, right? Sort of a thing.
Get the approval and don't show anybody it for another 12 months.
Because it's hard. I mean, if everyone, it's not like procurement leaders don't have an idea of what they want to achieve. Yeah. But, having an idea and then measuring against it are two very, very different things, right? So that's one space where we've seen procurement leaders say, hey, 90% plus are actually happy with the way they are doing category management in terms of the actual way they come up with the category strategy. They might have consultants involved in that process. There's many sort of experts that can be involved in terms of defining a category strategy. But a significant number of them are also saying that it's the one space that is a driver for digitization. Yeah. And that was surprising. I mean, we did not expect that sort of an output. The other thing that really caught us by surprise, we've all heard of the Great Recession. I mean, I think Paul Krugman of the New York Times recently started calling it, I think, the Great Reshuffling. He said, we want to look at it differently. It shouldn't be called, not the Great Recession, the Great Resignation.
Great Resignation,
My mistake, right? The Great Resignation, which Paul Krugman recently called the Great Reshuffling. Yeah. in the New York Times. And what was really interesting in the data is that, the rise of the external workforce, right, which we've been seeing that temp labor is, and just external work, whether it's consulting or just hiring of contingent labor, was more and more on the rise already. What was interesting is that the group of our respondents that responded most aggressively, in favor of this trend were chief supply chain officers. Right. And and when I think about it, it's kind of obvious, right? But when we hear about supply chain challenges, and the study we've done with the Harvard Business Review talks to this as well, we think about the Suez Canal getting blocked up, right? We think about there not being enough material available, but in reality, what we're hearing from the market is that there are not people available.
Yeah.
Right? That's why supply chains are clogging. So it's not just the fact that it's some temp labor you might need for some corporate office work that is now missing, and therefore you need to have a solution that can procure that temp labor. It is that people are not there on ports. People are not there to load up the ships, to load up the trucks, to deliver the items, etc. And that's what was most puzzling, in the sense that this is a core supply chain challenge that's resulting from labor shortage, and the solution to solve that might sit in the procurement of contingent labor, right? And that's really, I think, took us by surprise and started to get us thinking about how we would develop solutions for our customers in that area.
Yeah, I think that, when I think about, it's funny, when you talk about risk and I've talked about this on the podcast before, you talk about risk, and a lot of folks immediately think risk means physical supply chain, direct materials, moving something from point A to point B. There's obviously a lot of risk on the indirect side as well, and the provision of an indirect service, and the example I always use is around a call center. I used to buy call centers because that's kind of a good example, is that there are people involved. There's a supply chain involved in your call center provider being able to pick up and answer the phone when the phone rings.
Absolutely.
And we don't really think about that from a services, and we don't think all the risk that goes in behind. Can that building open? Can we get enough people there? Can they get their laptops? All those things. And that's
it's
what's
mission critical.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what's coming to the fore now, is that there's actually physical supply chains behind services as well.
Absolutely.
Which comes both on the availability of labor, but also on resiliency when we talk about resiliency.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
not just direct materials and the movement of goods from A to B.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, procurement has such a role, because organizations are finally, and it's like from the Great Recession to now, you think there's an opportunity for folks to look at how they use labor differently. And they didn't really do that. While technology enabled you to start kind of bring in labor from wherever you wanted and be more kind of task-oriented rather than people-oriented, times were good, people reinvested back in their own FTEs, and we kind of forgot what it was like in the recession.
Yes.
Now we're coming through, it's not cost that's driving this, it's actually shortage of labor that's now driving, like, how do I get access to the people that I need when I need them? And that's not necessarily just going and hiring somebody permanently anymore.
And what's interesting when you think about this topic and expand it, outside of our research, the Economist wrote about something called globalization, which was that this remarkable trend of globalization is kind of flattening. There's more nearshore happening, nearshore manufacturing that's been driven by robotic manufacturing and AI and all that wonderful stuff. But what the pandemic has taught us is that for a lot of the people that you need, doesn't really matter where they are. Right? So, it's funny where you might have a situation slowly where goods manufacturing could become more and more nearshore, but the services could actually become offshore.
It's kind of a reverse.
It's kind of a reverse, right? And that is actually a procurement challenge. If we do that, right? At least procurement should have the ability to show that an organization could flex in that manner if required. Procurement and supply chain, right? And I think that's some of what we are learning as well. We've all done now telehealth with doctors. I never thought that would pop.
Yeah.
But even now, as we're slowly we've come out of lockdowns. I had a recent appointment. And I said to my doctor, well, can we just do it by telehealth, because I don't want to drive, right?
Right.
It's
sit and wait for half an hour. And then,
exactly. We can just do it, because it's not something that required any sort of a physical examination, right? And I think you will see that a lot in terms of services in general, where one asks the question, well, does this person actually need to be physically on site, right? Or can the work happen remotely? And if it can happen remotely, then why would you restrict yourself to a labor pool in any sort of geographic constraint, right? And I think those are all the questions that need to be answered. And those are the things, apart from the cost savings, we spoke about sustainability already, but these are the things that procurement should actually elevate and challenge the C-suite with as potential solutions that they can offer, and see if they get a mandate.
Right.
And I think that elevates the profession holistically. We're seeing it in the data.
Yeah, it's you become an architect, because and then that's when you're truly driving business strategies, when you're looking and then saying, okay, well, the most effective place to that this resource based on talent pool and cost is actually somewhere else. So how do I architect a solution that takes advantage of that?
Absolutely.
As opposed to just, I'm going to just go and buy the supplier over here, or you're going to go and bring in an FTE, whatever it is.
Absolutely.
It's a different role, requires a different skill set. Where I see the procurement leaders who will be successful is when we're thinking, okay, how do we start to staff up to support that, the ability to be an architect as opposed to the ability to be a traditional procurement person, when so many of those traditional procurement activities are either not really necessary anymore or will be replaced by technology anyway.
I think there's an element of, business partnering that needs to happen within procurement.
Yeah.
I think HR started doing this, and I think it's been successful in general in the HR profession, and I think that would be a great way where if procurement is involved in sort of the line of business conversations within the organization, I think more and more of it becomes possible from there. But I think they have to be bold in terms of the way they approach these topics and offer these potential solutions, because they're there. Yeah.
And contingent labor is a great example of that, because traditionally procurement would come to that table with, how can I reduce the markups with the providers that we get from, how do I look at my labor rates and find opportunities to negotiate down the labor rate? And actually that's not where the opportunity is now. You could actually reduce total cost by having things done somewhere else, or breaking things down into tasks, or having a short-term worker who you only need for 10 hours to do something, rather than a consultant who you brought in to sit at a desk for 2 months. Those are where the opportunities are from a cost perspective, but not in a this is what their bill rate is versus that's what somebody else's bill rate is. And also, actually, how can I enable growth, or how can I enable business continuity by providing access to this talent where otherwise we can't get the people?
So for example, if you can go to an engineering leader, one of my engineering leaders, right, you can say, well, you've been trying to hire 40 engineers and it's been like 8 months and you've not been successful.
Yeah.
I can find you the same skill set. It won't be in this location, but we can find the same skill set and solve the problem. Do you want to keep waiting?
Right.
Right? Or do you want?
I help you?
Or can I help you find the people?
Yeah.
And that's a great conversation to have, and it kind of involves a little bit of HR as well, obviously, and but that's when you're actually being much more strategic in terms of driving the outcome that the business needs, than hey, I found you this person at a 10% discount. I mean, that's also cool. Don't get me wrong, right? But
it's not necessarily the value driver.
Yeah, in this case, it's not, right? Not when we're in a world where it's hard to find people in general, right? So, those are some of the findings of some of the research that we've done.
Because it was interesting you said about category management, and category management being a driver of digitization. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that because folks feel that they're more mature on the transactional side and they're now going upstream, or did you kind of have any?
That's a good question.
Any reasoning that you believe that data to be what it is?
I think the driver for that is that in the world we live in, data is used and mined in every single way to drive everything around us. But it's really hard still to do it in enterprise software. Yeah. Right? For a variety of reasons, data privacy, is security, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the question that is effectively being asked, which is, hey, why is it that with all of these data planes and, big data and all the technology and the advancements that have happened in terms of being able to process data, why is it that I can't really measure the goals that I set out to achieve? And why is it that the same sort of muscle can't be applied to a lot of the enterprise data that we process and put in the system every day? It actually leads to a broader point, right? Which is, can we mine data in a manner that allows for organizations to make better decisions at large in general, right? And that has a bunch of ethical constraints around it as well, right? I mean, am I technically using company B's data to tell company A what they're doing, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, this is a complicated question, right? If you want to honor all the privacy regulations that exist in the world. But with category management, at least you're sort of saying that, hey, Mr. Customer, you wanted to achieve these outcomes. How are you doing in terms of trying to achieve those objectives? And I think that's what the sentiment is from the customer community, that there must be a way to do this, right? Why is it a way that I cannot digitize this? Because you have captured all of my data in the system. Now reflect what it means in terms of the goals that I've been trying to achieve. I think it's a reflection of that more than anything else.
Yeah, and I definitely see that as a challenge in category management that procurement leaders find, especially those organizations where they don't have the ability to hire and recruit somebody who is a subject matter expert in every single thing that you buy, which is really impossible given the scope of what an organization buys anyway,
absolutely.
even for the bigger companies. But for the most part, let's say 80% of folks who are involved in category management are more of a journalist rather than a specialist. And I say that, that was me. I was a journalist rather than a specialist in category management. You don't necessarily know what the data's telling you, or how you can interpret it and how you can translate that into a good conversation with the stakeholder, so a stakeholder looks at you as somebody who can drive value for you because you have insights you can bring beyond what they know about a category. But then how does that translate into ultimately outcomes? I think that's probably one of the challenges, and there's a myriad of ways that you can start to address that gap. But I think that's probably one of the challenges from a category management that folks are seeing.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think 100%. How do you make it easier for me to do my job because you have access to so much data,
right?
And I can define my strategy, but I can't necessarily keep measuring against it as effectively as I want to, and it's a fair challenge. I mean, technology should be able to bridge that gap, and that's one of the things that I think we'll be focused on trying to do right in the near future.
One of the interesting data points to me, I think this was in the Economist study, was around operating models, like internally. And there was no adoption of a single or preferred operating model for procurement. It was a little bit all over the map, depending on who you asked, whether they see increasing centralization, whether you see a center-led model, whether you see increasing decentralization, whether you see a hybrid approach. There was no single kind of direction that all organizations are moving in.
And it was very difficult to sort of parse that data, except, you just sort of kind of said, okay, maybe the profession needs a little bit of direction here, almost, right? I mean, it was almost the way you interpreted it, right? Where, and even geographically, you couldn't tell a trend. It was fairly well split out, even when you looked at it geographically. I think a lot of that is just reflective of the fact that organizations are trying to figure out how to use procurement in a manner that is different from the traditional means that it's always been used, right? So, some people are putting it under operations more and more, and that gives it a little bit of a different tinge and a different way it ends up,
like the priorities or the metrics.
Absolutely, right? I mean, the way how you'll prioritize your goals. Obviously, a lot of organizations still have it under finance, right? And I think there wasn't necessarily a trend to be told in that direction. And I think the way I've interpreted that data is that, it goes back to a point that I was making earlier, which is you almost have to ignore from an operational structure where you might be reporting into, right? Or whether you're central-led or business partner-led or how that's, but can you actually define what you want to try to contribute to the business at large, right? And then that ends up being, a lot of the key drivers in terms of how you end up contributing, to the organization.
There was one really interesting piece about it was around risk and around what the risk is from an operational perspective, not in terms of risk that procurement is trying to help.
Yep.
And how the organization design, I was looking at CFOs. So CFOs see organization design and operating models. The more chance of those changing than what a CPO sees. So it's also like the execs that a CPO reports into sees operating model change in procurement. CPOs don't see that as much. So perhaps that's something that's coming down that we haven't opened our eyes to, and that the execs have something in mind that we don't see yet.
I think a lot of organizations at large in the C-suite are looking at the uncertainty and instability of the macroeconomics in the world, and I think in general they are foreseeing that there are going to be changes in the way the business needs to operate. And I think, I'm not sure if this is something unique to procurement. I think if you looked at,
the execs
the L2, L3 level, they might be unaware about potential operating model changes, but I think just the world that we live in today. When you talk about the L1 execs in an organization, I think a lot of them know that there will be operating model changes, whether it's to simplify or optimize or streamline or whatever it may be, or whether it's to just set it up differently to drive different sort of value, to impact different value drivers in an organization. I think there's a feeling out there that there will certainly be some sort of an operating model change to hedge against the risks that are out there. But I don't think that there's a clear definition of what that will necessarily be. And that's what we might find out in next year's report, right? Like when we do this again next year, we might have a better idea of what some of those changes are. And if there's a trend line that we can actually understand, because I don't think we could make it out this year, right? But I think maybe in 12 months' time, we might be in a position to sort of say, oh, this is clearly a trend line that's happening. Therefore, first of all, is it good, is it bad? What's our opinion on it, right? But therefore, how should we design solutions and consult our customers accordingly to be able to drive these organizational goals, right, that are coming from these decisions.
There was one interesting, just a final data point I want to touch on, was that there's often a fear within procurement that change means positions being eliminated. Digitization means positions being eliminated. And I've had this. I've worked in outsourcing. I've led a shared service center in India for a manufacturing firm for some time, and that was always the pushback of trying to drive change and trying to encourage people to have a different way of thinking and a different way of working. But what the data is suggesting is actually the opposite of that. That it's actually leading to more hiring in procurement.
I think, and I think some of the data on budgets as well, right? Like budgets are increasing in general, right? Despite all the disruptions as well. I mean, I think I would really invite procurement professionals to not think that way, right? I think you need to embrace the technological change and the innovations that are happening. Wouldn't it be great if machines could run tenders? Right. Like, why wouldn't that be great, right?
Why do we really want to do that kind of work?
Why would you want to do that kind of work, right? I mean, I think, and I think that's where we want to push the envelope as well. Like, let the machine run the tender. Like, let the machine spit out all the analysis that it needs to spit out for you, so that you can focus on defining category strategy, right? And actually working in a business partnership model that says, hey, perhaps I have a solution for your hiring problem, right? I think that's the space where most procurement professionals should want to be. Of course, I mean, you can always cut POs, process invoices, and run tenders, but that's not going to elevate the profession, right? And I think in general, I think from all the data, we have seen the experience we have, and the trends we're seeing in terms of how the profession can elevate, what the potential is for the profession to elevate. I don't think a machine, regardless of how smart you make it or how much AI you drive in it, is ever going to set a sustainability agenda for an organization, right? That's what people do. That's what people are best at doing, defining strategy, working with other people, working with partners, working with suppliers to set that type of agenda. Machines cannot do that, right? So, I mean, there was an expert in artificial intelligence who sort of had a very powerful line. He's like, there are things that machines will never be able to do, and people should embrace those things and embrace the fact that they might have an opportunity to focus on those things because the machines are doing the mundane work, right? And I think to some extent, the way technology is evolving, running tenders, cutting invoices, processing POs is mundane work, right? Checking if it's below an approval threshold or whatever. I mean, like, that's not something you want to eliminate as much of that work as possible. And the more you're able to think strategically, the more I think procurement makes itself valuable. And it doesn't happen at the expense of people. And I think that's what all the data is showing us as well. It'll probably result in an increase in headcount in procurement organizations because of the value they can contribute overall to the company.
And that's definitely what the data is showing so far.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Baber, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today here
Thank you,
live at SAP Sapphire Orlando. Very last question I always ask, and I always say it's the easy question. If anyone's try not to trip you up on this one. If anyone's listening today, they'd like to connect with you or learn more around what you're doing in procurement from SAP perspective, or even get a copy of the research reports when the research reports are published, where's the best places for them to kind of look out for that information?
Oh, I think we will be broadcasting it loudly everywhere. I think they'll be on all the organizations we've partnered with. I think you'll find them obviously on our websites. We'll be posting them on LinkedIn. If you want to get in touch with me, ping me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way to do so. We'll certainly get in touch and would love to have a conversation with anyone.
All right. Well, what I'll do is I'll include those links when they become available, along with the link to your LinkedIn profile, all on our show notes page for today's episode.
Perfect.
Listeners can find all of our episodes at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.podcast, and you'll find this episode, and you'll see all the links there. So, one last time, Baber, thank you very much for joining me today on the show.
It was my pleasure.
Thank
you, Philip.
If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward